think we're on. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, all right, good, good. Everybody welcome on behalf of the School of Public Affairs and the Department of Public Administration and the Levine family. I want to welcome you all this evening to a night celebrating achievement and excellence in terms of scholarship, but also, as is customary in terms of our Levine Lecture, also a sub-theme, and I think that is a sub-theme that deals with institutions. Institutions perhaps under some assault today, not only in this city, but across the country in terms of public service, but also institutions in transition. And you're going to hear tonight how our school is in some transition, as well as our department. The final aspect of institutions and institutionalization is the theme of really building and rebuilding institutions. And we have one of the leading scholars in the country tonight dealing with institutions who's been a real pathbreaker in that, and Professor Lynn. More on him in a few moments. What an appropriate time and what a way to honor Charlie Levine in terms of his accomplishments than to focus on scholarship and to focus on institution building and people who are able to work both in practice and also in scholarship. As many of you know, Charlie was, well, he passed too soon, there's no question about that, but he was certainly a person who saw things before others did in our field, who saw trends, who saw issues, and unlike many of us, he also rolled up his sleeves and he got involved in those issues. His publication record, certainly in a brief career of 9 books and kind of serial publications in some of the leading journals in our field, widely recognized as a pathbreaker and a leader. Not only did he win research awards, but I think what's even more impressive is that after his passing, there are 3 or 4 major awards that are named after Charlie Levine, and I can't think of a better testimony to a person, not only to his character and his productivity, but for people to take that step and his colleagues. I know several of you were friends. We have some friends of Charlie Levine in the audience tonight. Several of you were had Charlie as a mentor, and it's just so great and such a delight to see some faces coming back for our award. Charlie was a pracademic in the finest sense of that term. He was a person who could walk comfortably and be respected both in the world of practice and in the world of scholarship. I think, the testimony to his work, not only in terms of the Paul Volcker Commission on Public Service is a testimony to how he did roll up his sleeves and try to get involved in these issues. His work at the Congressional Research Service was outstanding. And this university was fortunate, and we have some people with us tonight who were instrumental in bringing Charlie to American University. I also can't think of a better time to be gathering in Charlie's name in this city with several of the issues that we're facing in terms of public management and public service. Dealing with some of the really intergenerational kinds of issues that we're dealing with. We're assembled tonight in a town where we have a Supreme Court dealing with some issues that will affect all of us in many generations and are incredibly important to deal with. And we can get into some other issues as well. I suspect, although I can't be sure, that Charlie would have been involved in these issues today. And I can't precisely say what he might be doing, but I do know one thing. I do know that at his side would have been probably the love of his life in terms of his wife, Elaine Levine. And I wonder if we could ask Elaine to stand, and if you would join me in a round of applause for Elaine Levine. As I said, institution building is a key area. Some of you have perhaps had the opportunity to see our slideshow that got started a little late. We'll give you the whole show later when we break for our reception. Those of you who have been here for 2 or 3 years and are veterans of the talk have seen growth in the number of slides, and also I hope in terms of the quality and the level and the achievements of our faculty and also of our PhD students. We're extremely proud of what's happened. And frankly, the Department of Public Administration couldn't have done that without the active support, really the unflinching support of our Dean, Bill Leogrand. Bill has been our Dean for 10 years. And he has decided now that finally he wants to get back and do what he really loves, which is his research. Bill also fits into the category that I just described. In addition to his deanship responsibilities, Bill is also one of the leading figures and one of the leading academics in the area of Latin American politics and also in terms of U.S. foreign policy toward Latin America. He's got 5 books, edited, co-authored books, his own single-authored books. He publishes routinely in the leading journals in his field. And in his spare time, he tries to keep a bunch of academics in line, and he has brought us to prominence in the Washington, D.C. area, but not only there, also nationally. So please welcome Bill Liljegren.
Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me well, I studied Cuba. And, you know, with the passing of Fidel Castro, not the passing, but stepping down of Fidel Castro, from the presidency a few years ago, the Cubans have been very much involved in trying to figure out how they're going to build institutions and make the transition from that kind of charismatic leadership. In any event, I want to welcome you on behalf of the School of Public Affairs to the Charles H. Levine Memorial Lecture. I'm very glad that Elaine and Jordan are with us on this very special occasion. I want to also, in particular, applaud the faculty in the Department of Public Administration and Policy, and especially Bob Durant, who as chair at the time took the initiative to conceptualize and then operationalize and launch this memorial lecture. I think it's a wonderful honor for us to be able to bring people together to talk about Charlie's legacy and to present to you some of the leading scholars in the field. And I will say that it is you know, Charlie's enduring influence that we have no trouble at all recruiting the very best scholars in the field to come and give this lecture. Although Charlie was with us very too briefly a time, he made his presence felt. He was our first distinguished professor in the department. He helped lift the department to the national prominence that it enjoys today. And I'm happy to report that the department continues to have a number of its programs ranked in the top 25 nationally. The public management program, with which Charlie was most closely connected, ranks number 8, and the School of Public Affairs overall now ranks number 12 in the nation. Today, the number and quality of our students in the MPA, the MPP, and the PhD programs are higher than ever. And the department, as you'll see, as you already began to see in the slideshow, and we'll see in the rest of it during the reception, has attracted just a tremendous group of new young faculty members who are carrying on in the tradition of excellence in teaching and scholarship that Charlie helped to build. This lecture series in his name, now in its 3rd year, brings to campus, as I said, some of the most highly regarded scholars in the field, people just like Charlie Levine. And so it's fitting tribute to his memory, and I especially want to welcome this year's speaker, Professor Laurence Lynn. Thank you for being with us this evening. With that, let me turn the microphone over to Bob again for the next stage in the program. Bob?
As you know, Bill, the Department of Public Administration is always ahead of the curve in terms of the SPA building, and we always like to be cutting edge. So we know there's going to be a reception honoring Bill's contributions to the school next in April. But we wanted to be first aboard to give you the first award as acting dean. It's supposed to say Bill Liljegren, Dean of the Decade. And we figured an armored suit might have been available.
Every dean needs one.
Would need one. Would need one. So
thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Now, when you speak of institution builders, it doesn't take long to get down the list to talk about Howard McCurdy. Our former chair is indeed an institution builder. And I think back to right before I first came. And at that point in time, there were a whole host of retirements. in the department. There was a great period of transition. Some kid by the name of Kerwin decided he wanted to move on to administration. I wonder how that worked out. I guess it worked out pretty well. I guess he's now our president. So probably a good career choice. But Howard was really faced at that time with building on the foundations. And he, Laura Langbein, David Rosenblum, Bernie Ross, the late Bernie Ross, who was also an institution builder at American University, really began to build and to recraft a department that really faced some challenges. And so many of the people in the slides that you see up here are directly Howard's responsibility, Howard's initiatives, along with Laura, along with David, and along with Bernie. So Howard is another guy who's not only an institution builder but also well known in terms of academia. When he stands here, those of you who don't know him already, he may look kind of familiar to you. He's probably one of our leading experts on space policy, but he's also one of our leading and most prominent historians in the field of public administration. Award-winning books, done a variety of other things in his career. Anytime he starts to get a big head, I like to remind him that when I was sitting as an MPA student, I read his textbook to prepare for my exam, and I'm no spring chicken. So how old do you think Howard might be by the time we get down here? In all seriousness, a true institution builder and a real leader in our field, Howard McCurdy.
I'm not up here to take any praise. I'm here to remember Charlie. Charlie joined the faculty in the late 1980s. We just reorganized ourselves into a School of Public Affairs with 3 departments. And Bob Boynton was our department chair, and Neil Kerwin was soon to be our school dean. We thought we needed to have a distinguished scholar to advance the cause of the department, and so Bernie Ross enticed Charlie to join the faculty. His work on cutback management had appeared about 10 years earlier. Charlie was destined to have that work included in classics of public administration. He thought, to explain his influence, what he thought was that the theories we had about management and public administration only worked with the ship of state moving forward. That it wasn't attuned to what would happen in cases of retrenchment. And to think of some of the great theories in the field, incremental budgeting kind of assumes that you've got a base and you're adding little increments every year. Administrative pluralism exalted earmarks and log rolling. Agencies with excess funds engaged in policy analysis and program evaluation. Charlie, just being as cantankerous as he normally was, said, well, what's it like if you put the ship of state in reverse? What happens to all these theories and these descriptions of what goes on in public administration? I think it's really important to think how contrary to the prevailing opinion that was at that time. Oh yeah, California had Proposition 13. New York was bankrupt again. But most governments in the United States were steaming full throttle ahead. He used the word to describe his own work that it was anomalous. It was something that wasn't part of the mainstream of the field, but maybe might be useful someday. Little did we know that 3 decades later, it would come to occupy a central place in the emerging literature of public administration. And we have a lot of experience with government in reverse. We just don't use it the same way. Charlie said we should systematically begin to study what it's like when you put the state engine in reverse. Think of it. In the Civil War, we created the Transcontinental Railroad. Congress didn't have a nickel, and it was able to start that. He's influenced my own work. I was interested to see how NASA could innovate under conditions of fiscal scarcity. And so I did a book on the faster, better, cheaper initiative, the cheaper being the emphasis that Charlie wanted us to see. By the 1980s, he'd published 3 books on cutback management. His book on the politics of retrenchment and 2 readers on fiscal stress. He was thinking about a subject that wouldn't really rise to its full fruition for another 30 years. Personally, what I remember about him was that he had an office on the south side of the Ward Circle building, and a windowed office. We have a distinguished professor, we had to give him a window. And looked downtown, which was okay with him because he spent a lot of time downtown. But what I I remember him personally as somebody who was always cheerful. Look at the picture on the back of the program. You want to know what Charlie looked like? That's what he was, always smiling. Think of that. I mean, here's a guy who's dealing with fiscal retrenchment, and he looks, he's always optimistic. He'd probably find some way to find optimism in our current situation. It wouldn't defeat him to think about it. His insights on cutback management continue to influence the field 35 years after he started to publish them. We hold this lecture because we want people to remember him and to remember his writings. Now, you're going to introduce Lee, but I don't want to get up here without saying something. You think I'm old. And we didn't have search committees back then. A long story, but I won't go there. Lee was in the group of people who hired me back before the Ward Circle building was even in existence. We were downtown at that time, but he's one of the first people I met when I came to American University. Lee, it's great to see you again, but Bob's going to introduce you.
Thank you, Howard. After standing next to Bill Leogrand and Howard McCurdy, basketball comes to mind. I don't know why that is, but many of you, as many of you know, the great legendary basketball coach John Wooden used to have, well, he had a lot of phrases, but one of the phrases was, never, never, never confuse activity with accomplishment. And I thought that was really poignant. And one way to show accomplishment in our field is to write a book that's a classic in terms of public policy, in terms of administration. And Howard's already begun the introduction. Lee Fritchler has such a book. And it's a book, I don't want to make you feel you too old, but that was one of the first books I had too, Lee, in class. The Politics of Smoking, now in its 7th edition, moving ahead, de rigueur citation in terms of regulatory policy in the United States. Lee, also a person who was an institution builder. He was our dean in a former incarnation, different title of the School of Public Affairs. He moved on to become president of Dickinson College. He also served in terms of being a pracademic. He was also very active in terms of a career as assistant secretary at the Department of Education. He was also a vice president at the Brookings Institution, where he was a director of a center on educational policy for the White House. He led the White House initiative on historically black colleges and universities. So he's done everything. He's the whole package. And tonight he was a very, very close friend of Charlie Levine. And so I've been tardy in inviting him, and tonight at last we've been able to get Lee Fritchler here. Lee?
I think I surprised Howard by walking up here on my own. No assistance needed. Not yet, Howard. I'm delighted to be here, Elaine, and Jordy. It's great to have this reunion with you two, especially at such a nice event. I can't think of a better way to remember Charlie. When I think of Charlie, I think of two things generally. One is his sense of humor, and the other is his scholarship. This impish smile on the back of the program and earlier on the screen is a great indicator of his sense of humor. We had a heck of a lot of fun together. I can't tell you all of it, but I also think, I want to say, and here maybe this is a sign of my age, but his sense of humor is sort of dated now, of course, and the things that we thought were funny just aren't so funny anymore, I find. But I'm going to try one out on you. Back when we were both at Brookings, Charlie would drive into our house in the district and park his car, and then Susan, Charlie, and I would ride down to Brookings on Massachusetts Avenue, and it was the nicest commute you could imagine, in part because we listened to Hardin and Weaver. Anybody in this room remember Hardin and Weaver? Well, they had this kind of a sense of humor. On Monday mornings, they would say, now here come the football scores, and they'd start 21-7, 13-3, 14-6. You see, that kind of humor doesn't go over anymore. But you have to say the name of the team today. In those days, he was just giving the scores. Well, anyway, Charlie was really a wonderful guy to be with, and I have many happy memories of being with him. He was also, of course, a great scholar. You've heard a lot about that already, and I think you'll hear more. There's not too much I can add to that. But what I remember Charlie as being is not only a fine scholar, but a fine member of the academic community. He was a great mentor to students and to his colleagues. He was my mentor even for a while. I think he gave up on that, and I remember when I told him that I was going to go off to Dickinson College and to administration as president, he looked at me and he shook his head and he said, "In 3 years, your brains will be mashed potatoes." And I think he was wrong about that. I think French fries would have been a better metaphor. But it was the kind of advice he gave. And he passed away, actually, the first couple of months that I was in Carlisle. And I happened to be in Europe at the time and missed the funeral. I actually didn't even learn of his death until just before the funeral occurred. And of course, those were the days before internet, and communications were very, very difficult. So in a sense, this is a closing of the loop for me, because I didn't have a chance to say how much I loved him, but I do tonight. Thank you.
Some people have asked me about the timing. Why do we do this in March? And I must say, working with the Levine family, they've never made any demands in terms of speakers or anything else, except for one demand, that we not hold this talk either during the final game of the NCAA finals or during the Final Four. So I think we've tried to accommodate those wishes. And the person who's really responsible for that, I think, mostly has been his son Jordy Levine. Jordy is an investment analyst for the Red Cross now, and he's in town, and we're glad to have him with us tonight. And he received his a couple of degrees, but he has a degree in business from the University of Chicago. So please welcome Jordan Levine. Jordan would like to welcome you tonight.
Thank you very much. Though I might watch out because you made my mom stand up. But I just want to say my mom and I are pleased to be here for the third annual lecture in memory of my father. And we want to thank you, Professor Durant, for having this event. It's really a great honor to him and to us. And I'd like to thank Dean Leo Grand, Dr. McCurdy, Dr. Johnston, Dr. Lee Fritzler, and to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Lynn. I'd also like to thank Dr. Lynn for his service to the Harris School, where I also studied. And it's kind of funny that I never met him until today, because he was at the Harris School while I was there, and then the LBJ School, actually, I briefly contemplated getting a PhD, and that was the only school that accepted me and gave me funding, and so it's a small world. but oh dear, I have a note here to where my mom asked me to say something nice and funny about my memories visiting Lee Fritzler, but unfortunately I was only 10 or 11 years old, so I don't really remember, but I do remember he had a very, very grand house that they had for him. But I do remember I went back to Dickinson, and he when I was 14 for a summer camp. He was very kind to me. And lastly, I want to thank our friends, neighbors, and father's colleagues who've been so generous with your contributions to the Memorial Fund to benefit the research of the graduate students in the department, and thank everyone for being here today. It's a beautiful day outside, so you're sacrificing something, and you could be waiting in line for our Mega Millions.
Well, we've arrived at the time for our featured event of the evening. We have two featured events, but I think the most important is our lecture series, and then we're going to have an award ceremony for our PhD students for the winner of the Best Paper Award. I was delighted to hear from Larry Lynn that he would be willing to join us and to give this third Levine Memorial Lecture. You know, we've emphasized scholarship. We've emphasized people who are pracademics. We've emphasized institution builders, and Larry fits precisely into all of those categories during his career. A prolific scholar. His research contributions have been recognized by awards not just in one area, but in several areas. In that sense, he has won the John Gauss Award, the Dwight Waldo Award, and the list goes on, the George Frederickson Award, and on and on and on in terms of his contributions. Not bad for an economist in public administration. But what sets Larry apart, I think, when I think of his contributions, is along with David Rosenblum, there are certain foundational people in our field. That is, people who are going to be read, and 30 years from now, when we're in Levine 40, they'll be talking about his work. All of us hope to make a contribution to the field, and there are certain people who have helped to shape a field. And I think Larry joins David and some others in our field who have done that, and it's a tremendous accomplishment. He's also, in terms of, been a pracademic in the sense that he began his career as he held high-level positions in 3 federal departments: the Department of the Interior, Assistant Secretary level positions, or Deputy Assistant Secretary positions, the Department of the Interior, at the Defense Department, and then at the old Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, now DHHS today. He has also mentored students, and I think we have at least 2 people in the room that Larry has mentored during his career. Carolyn Hill, Carolyn, I don't know if you're here. Carolyn Hill from Georgetown University, one of Larry's students, and is a co scholar on a book which I think will be remembered for a long time, and that's Public Administration: A Three-Dimensional Approach. He's also mentored people such as Tony Bertelli, and I think another book that's going to be remembered for a long time is the book entitled Madison's Managers. He's also mentored another person, I believe, in the room, Steve Smith, who's with us, who was visiting us this semester. And so that's a legacy that people have left, much as Charlie left a legacy in terms of friends and colleagues, et cetera, around the field. Larry has done that, and incredibly impressive. He's taught at our leading universities. He's taught at Stanford University. He's taught at Harvard University. He's been taught at the University of Chicago, and also had some administrative responsibilities there as dean, and spent 5 years as dean. So there is life after deanship, Bill. That's good to know. That's good to know. Currently, he is the Sid Richardson Research Professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and simultaneously the Stein Professor Emeritus of Public Management at the University of Chicago. We're delighted again to have him with us, and without further ado, please welcome Larry Lynn.
These guys think they're old. I'm too old to even stand up to give a lecture, but I will do my best from a more comfortable position for my back, and thank you for putting up with that. Mrs. Levine, Jordan Levine, Dean Leo Grand, Dean Fritzler, Charlie's friends and students and colleagues and guests for this, what is obviously a very festive occasion. It's a great honor for me. and to be able to memorialize someone who was so widely admired and so broadly influential. I didn't know Charlie well. There's a very good reason for that. I spent money in my career in the government and loved doing it. And the whole idea of cutback management, now I'm being heard. The whole idea of cutback management is anathema to me, and I hope never to practice it. But nonetheless, I felt like I knew Charlie because so many of my close friends and colleagues knew Charlie and knew him well, and his name comes up virtually every week somewhere because people have known him and they are respectable of his work. His books are in my library and they're on my reference list. So it's a friendship I wished I'd had, and at least I have the privilege of being able to deliver this lecture. And I want to say in addition that to thank my hosts who have been superb in getting me around, and also the various people I've been able to meet, the many groups of students that I've had a chance to talk to. I've been very impressed, and there's clearly a spirit here and a momentum that you all ought to be proud of. And I've been a lot of different places at one time or another, and this is clearly a place that's doing a wonderful job of preparing people for public service, and for the right reasons, and under a faculty that clearly knows how to do that. And so I want to thank you all for Bob and others that and Stephanie, who has gotten me to where I was supposed to go in a building that I found bewildering. And I don't know, I kept feeling I was going in circles and we'd always end up somewhere different. But anyway, it was that part of it was kind of fun too. So here's the text for this evening. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, suppose the founder spirits were to be among us tonight. They might want to ask us about that more perfect union, about that domestic tranquility. How are we doing? We might have to say it's been worse, but if you give us a little more time, we may be able to reach a new low. Stress fractures in the foundation, the founder scheme of governance, have become ever more noticeable in recent years. CNN, the Center for Public Integrity, Scientific American Magazine, Time Magazine, Mother Jones Magazine have all shown a bright light on what they all call broken government. The author of the Time article excuse me, reminisced that he remembered his first days in the Washington Bureau of Time magazine back in the 1980s. And he said that he was just very impressed at the easy camaraderie that existed across the aisles in Congress. He said all of the public jockeying and rhetoric seemed more like theater than like serious politics. And I can say from my own decade in government that I pretty much have the same memory, that moderates were among the most influential and competent people in both houses of Congress and basically in all three branches of government. And somehow it all seemed that we were doing what we were supposed to be doing. And what James Madison, who I'm going to speak about later, would have us do. Now what we have is that this odd situation that a document that was conceived in compromise, the Constitution of the United States, is now being invoked by powerful factions who say they will never compromise on their principles, as the founders, of course, obviously had to do. Maybe all this is the media echo chamber doing what it does. It's hard to ignore, however, surveys by particularly the Pew Research Center for the People and the Press, which document the extent to which the people trust their government and their political institutions. Trust, as probably many of you, most of you know, has been declining for decades, basically since the Vietnam War. But it reached an all-time low just before the 2010 midterm elections, and it has shown few signs of recovery since that point. Less than 20% trust factors, and Congress frequently gets even lower ratings. Broken government is one of the rare issues on which there is bipartisanship. Both left and right are prophesying doom. One, because there is simply too much government, and one, because there is simply too little government. A recent lament concerns a new lament. We can probably have several features on that. Is the disappearance of the center. The center that Yates said could not hold. Not only do we have a center that cannot hold, we don't have a center. It's not there anymore, as far as we can see. People who would be considered moderates or who have served in Congress for a very long time, in the Senate and the House, have been retiring and giving up their seats and not seeking re-election, and with increasing frequency saying why. And that is that the stresses and strains and unpleasantness of the job are driving them out of roles that they performed and performed essentially and necessarily on behalf of our republic. So in a new book, I mean, the beat goes on. A new book, a judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals, actually the Fourth Circuit, argues that owing to failures in compromise by both left and right, issues once left to the people have been increasingly become the province of the courts. And the result is that the role of representative institutions has become very much reduced, and that we, as a consequence, and this is his phrase, are becoming bereft of our democratic liberties. It's a conservative justice, by the way, appointed by Ronald Reagan. Political scientists tell us that inability to create consensus, inability to compromise, constitutes a real threat to democratic stability. What does broken government mean? Well, consider the debt crisis of 2011. And I want to quote some passages from a conservative columnist that I'm sure many of you read, I hope many of you read, well, I just started reading him, but because he's getting better. Michael Gerson of the Washington Post. The crisis revealed, he says, a number of weaknesses in the political system. The presidency was weakened. When one party took a routine procedure, the debt limit increase, and turned it into a powerful policy lever. That party had come to be dominated by an intransigent faction that attained a virtual veto power over pragmatic solutions to the crisis. the resulting policy, and this is again in Gerson's words, would hurt the poor and the unemployed the most. It would jeopardize our economic recovery, our struggling economy, and make it more difficult. Ideological polarization of the two political parties made serious discussion of the most important issues, taxation and entitlements, literally impossible. Why would, Gerson asks, a credit rating agency, a foreign investor, or even the American people trust a system that couldn't seem to address in a reasonable way its own problems and issues of that seriousness? My own question is, why in the world would a major political party deliberately put the nation's well-being at risk that way? They could have put it at risk in all kinds of ways, but they did it that way. That's a partisan statement, and I apologize. Anyway, from that sublime nail-biter, let's go to a ridiculous nail-biter. And forgive the details, but that's where the devil is, and particularly in this case. In this summer of 2011, again, 2011 was a great year for our government breaking down. The Federal Aviation Administration was forced to shut down. Many of you know the story, I'm sure, leading to the immediate unemployment of 74,000 employees of the FAA and of its contractors. The reason was a disagreement between the Senate and the House concerning the provisions in legislation which had passed in 2007. That would, the provisions that would provide long-term authorization for the funding of FAA operations. The chair of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee slipped into the short-term funding resolution. They were about to run out of money, literally run out of money. The appropriation was running out within days. Slipped into the legislation a provision that cut funds for the Essential Air Service Program. How many of you have heard of the Essential Air Service Program? Hands? Aha. Nobody. Or did, I didn't see anybody. But there wasn't a forest of hands. And what that does is it subsidizes the operations of rural airports that otherwise couldn't pay for themselves, they wouldn't have the funds to continue operations. What the congressman also did was added a provision that would reverse a regulatory ruling that airline workers can form a union if a majority of the ballots favor it, which is the standard way to conduct union elections in most places of employment. So that would have been reversed, which would mean that the status quo would revert to the status quo in which employees not voting were counted as no votes. So you can see the implications of that, making unionization all that much harder. These changes seemed directed at the interests of certain Democratic, particularly their senators. For example, one of the rural airports was in Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid's home district. Can that have really been accidental? The Senate refused to accept these provisions to the continuing resolution, and so the FAA shut down. It was rescued, even as the debt limit was rescued, but it was a cliffhanger. This is the kind of the beauty part. Washington Post reporter, actually it was Dana Milbank, reported as follows. Congressman John Mica, the Florida Republican, blamed for single-handedly shutting down the Federal Aviation Administration, sounded like a beaten man when he called me Thursday evening. The usually biting chairman of the House Transportation Committee spoke with real remorse about the standoff, which put the 74,000 people out of work, as I said, but not only that, it caused the delays in a whole set of airline safety projects, airport safety projects, and it cost hundreds of millions of dollars to basically have to stop and start all over again. And this is Congressman Mica speaking. He said, oh, we had a brutal week. Getting beat up by everybody, he said. What he basically said, so, you know, I didn't ever realize it was going to cause this much consternation, those things. And I don't know what to do or what to say. Now, at this point, you may be hearing the shades of the founders murmuring, who are these people? What are they doing? Much of our current politics seems to be what I call pre-constitutional. It would seem that a great many of our officials or elected officials, that if they had their way, the values that are to be revered by them and by our officials in general are not those on display in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, but rather the values of those who settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony 150 years earlier. Puritans were not seeking what the founders sought, which was liberty and justice for all, and the rights of individuals that are the envied by all who study our Constitution. Rather, they were what the values that they desired were a community of believers in which their beliefs concerning morality and immorality should be the basis for union and domestic tranquility. So they would have had a constitution, if you can imagine this, that would have been written by the likes of John Winthrop rather than the likes of James Madison. James Fallows, in a recent Atlantic article, pretty much said the same thing. He said in the same vein that he thinks his opinion is never before in American history has American party alignment been so closely correlated with religion. Well, okay, the reality of that are students of this school and the other public administration and policy school, the reality is that policy making at all levels of government is now, it now requires countless detailed decisions that are both arcane but consequential to the American people in their very many categories and groups and with their many diverse interests. It's consequential for politics, consequential for public administration, these detailed provisions of our policies. While the jugular, the big blood-pumping features of major legislation, such as the individual mandate in the Affordable Care and the Health Reform Act, gets all the attention, the capillaries, the little smaller places where life's blood flows, such as the minimum loss provision ratio. How many have heard of the minimum loss provision ratio? Okay. It's a fascinating issue. It's just a great issue. Actually, I had friends that predicted that would be the basis for declaring the bill unconstitutional. Instead, both parties got that solved with the insurance industry in a rather quick order. Who knew? Anyway, those things are the ones that can easily be caused, those kinds of things can become the cause of crises, just as the, kind of who knew we subsidized rural airports. So that's what policymaking now is vulnerable to, is the fact that so many things can become so controversial so quickly, before we know it. The upshot is, according to its critics, the Madisonian governance cannot be trusted to produce either the procedural fairness that legitimizes its outcomes, or the socially desirable outcomes that legitimate its procedures. A more perfect union, indeed. Again, what we might ask our founders, what were you thinking? And is it time for a do-over? Well, the prospect of dire failings in our political system, and my governor, for example, I mentioned this to students today, my governor has signaled clearly that he would no doubt be very pleased if his state could secede from the Union. I really do believe he means that. Anyway, that raises legitimate questions about the governance of America, that we could even contemplate that happening. Maybe we make mistakes by holding our constitutional scheme sacred. Perhaps there are too many checks and balances, and too little, and too much power in Washington and too little in the states. Perhaps there is too much regulation and not enough responsibility. Perhaps there is not enough entrepreneurship. Maybe those things should be rethought, and we should consider exactly how this society and the 21st century should be governed constitutionally. That the current volatile array of groups and categories of Americans, each pursuing its own, often narrowly defined interests, has led to deep fissures in the popular will. That may have happened is not, however, a reason for regarding that the constitutional scheme is invalid. It's not a valid argument against Madisonian government. If America survived is to survive as a great republic, a great democracy, the solutions to these problems must come from within the constitutional scheme itself. The solution is not structural, but political. Madison, among others, understood, I think, the contemporary problem, understood problems like the contemporary problem that we are facing. This is obscured, I think, by the fact that many readings of Madison's words, particularly in the Federalist and other founders, they give too little attention to some of the words. They quote far too little. Some of the words that I think give deeper meaning to what they meant by how to secure liberty and justice, how to sustain a governance that's seeking liberty and justice for all. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is to talk about the success of America's what Madison called his compound republic, and to see that it depends not only on the capacity of formal governing structures to balance competing interests, and to balance competing values, but it also ultimately depends on the wisdom, common sense, and inherent fairness of the virtue, if you will, to use the old term, of the people themselves, of the candidates that run for office, of those who are become public officials, of those in the diverse groups and factions. In some sense, good structural arrangements can get us so far, but they cannot be the final guarantee of what we are seeking in our own system of government. In the Federalist number 47 and number 51, Madison basically laid out the design of the constitutional scheme. In Federalist 47, for example, the particular structures of the government and the distribution of power among them, among its constituent parts, that is, among the three departments of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial, were laid out. The powers that he laid out, why he proposed things the way he did, or why the founders were doing it that way. The argument, he was trying to rebut the argument that was made by many other members of the Constitutional Convention and others, that the three departments were really not independent of each other, that they had overlapping powers, and the argument was that they should be completely independent of each other, each branch having its own basis in the people. And what Madison was saying is, no, there's not a single one of the colonies that are to be united that has that kind of constitution for itself. The United Kingdom, its widely admired democracy, does not have that kind of system for itself. And Montesquieu basically originated the tripartite scheme, doesn't advocate that kind of independence. Instead, what Madison was arguing was that you have to look out for certain vital concerns, such as the competence of judges, such as the ability of the executive to have sufficient resources and authority to be able to act, for example, concerning war powers and other things. So he said deviations from a strict separation of powers are clearly necessary. So that was Federalist 47. Federalist number 51, which is his probably most famous essay, is titled, the long title, "The Structure of the Government Must Furnish the Proper Checks and Balances Between the Different Departments." In that particular essay, Madison explained the structural key to understanding American democracy. He addressed the question, how are we to make sure that the separation of powers is maintained in practice? And his answer, his argument is both, and this is a great essay, if those of you ought to reread it. It's a wonderful argument. It's both a passionate polemic and it's a very elegantly argued defense of, it's a passionate polemic in defense of liberty, and it's an elegantly argued case for the particular structures of government that they're setting up. A balance of power will be secured, he said, he wrote, by what he called an interior structure of checks and balances. This is all part of among his more famous passages. Checks and balances between the separate departments of the government. Madison's argument proceeds from the premise that each department, again, these are famous passages, each department should have a will of its own, while that principle might be secured by giving each department, completely independent authority to act on the part of the people, that each department must be given the motives and the means to resist the encroachments of the others. And perhaps his most famous words were, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Now, the checks and balances in the Constitution itself are familiar. I'm not going to talk about them here. However, Madison also had another passage that I want to quote, in which he referred to something called the subordinate distributions of power. Very seldom invoked words of Madison. Here are his words. This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives might be traced to the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. We see it, particularly, these are Madison's words still, displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. Now, the concept of subordinate distributions of power can be construed as depicting what we now have, and that is a system that may be termed subordinate checks and balances, which have been created pursuant to the exercise of constitutional authority by legislative bodies, by any body that has any entity that has the power to create rules and guidelines that have a force of law. These subordinate checks and balances are defined in statutes and other, as I say, rules and guidelines and the like, as well as in conventions of governance, such as the standing rules of the Senate and the House, the nominating procedures of the political parties, and even systems that not contemplated in the Constitution, like the powers of the Federal Reserve System. Now, four categories. This is from Carolyn in my book, where we first unveiled all this great thinking. The four categories of subordinate checks and balances encompass a wide swath of what may be termed, or what Madison termed, the whole system of human affairs. I'm going to list them. This is going to go briefly. The checks and balances of one branch on another. The example of that is legislative and legislatively authorized oversight and investigation powers and practices. Checks that operate within the branches of government themselves. Inspectors General is a good example. Checks by the people, that is, by private citizens and organizations on the branches of government, examples of which are the Freedom of Information Act and Government and Sunshine Acts. And finally, delegations of power, or acknowledgments of power and influence of private individuals or organized entities. Example, the Federal False Claims Act, which authorizes employees of government contractors to be able to claim that their companies are ripping off the government without fear of penalty. So these sorts of checks and balances, long lists of them, have a pervasive effect on the character and on the extent of government's capacity to deliberate, to decide, and to implement the manifold expressions of the public will that are embodied in our complex public policies. Now, the Madison and the other founders believed that their exceptional scheme of government would lead to balance. That was the goal. The goal was balance, a balance that secured justice and liberty, which could be considered a form of equilibrium, and basically it has served that function for us over our 200+ year history. However, that is a question that we now face: is whether we'll continue to do that. when the political branches of government have been in the hands of different political parties, the resulting stalemates when the balance has been difficult to strike and there's stalemates, usually the causes of that, the reasons for that, could be traced back to, or historically have been able to trace back to, divisions among the people. So eliminating a stalemate has to do with achieving eventually, as quickly as possible, preferably, clarity and sense of direction that breaks the stalemate, or until some elections are held and the creators of stalemate confront voters and who have a chance to change things. What must be recognized about Madison's notion of balance is its debt to Scottish economist Adam Smith. And this is another very little known, I think, aspect of Madison's thinking. The similarity between their thinking is really quite striking. Madison and the other American founders were familiar with Smith's Wealth of Nations. They knew the book and perhaps had read passages from it. And they shared the basic values that Smith was professing in his book about capitalism. As a consequence, according to at least one scholar, a scholar named David Prindle, Madison believed that the politics in commerce, competition among self-interested participants, if correctly structured, could function in the same beneficial way as it does for free markets. That is, it could produce balance and what he called republican virtue. Madison trusted the political hand. Prindle continues, I'm going to quote him a bit here. Madison is a philosopher of regulated conflict, but he is not an advocate of amoral struggle, as some have interpreted him to be. He intends the competition his system creates to force self-interested individuals to become partisans of public virtue. I love that phrase, partisans of public virtue. As with Smith, it turns out that given the right sort of social order, the evident tendency of men to pursue their own interests is a good thing, not a problem. So the extent to which Madison's argument on behalf of checks and balances and separation of powers depends on the overall pattern of government cannot really be overstated. He saw that the creation of this balance wasn't just the handful of checks and balances that in the Constitution and out of it or created subsequently, but it took into account federalism, that we have enumerated powers for the federal government and reserved powers for the states and the people. It includes pluralism, all those people and all those factions. It includes independent judiciary at all levels of government. Eventually, so you have all those governments, all those factions, all those courts, all those judges, which acting together constitute the process that he saw as validating his claims that that the constitutional scheme would work toward a balance of the values and the interests that would ultimately constitute basically a compromise that would enable us to achieve our constitutional goals. But something's going wrong now. It's finely wrought scheme, and it is a finely wrought scheme. Madison was the founder of the field we now call institutional design. The political scientists write about with considerable less felicity. Anyway, that isn't it this scheme that is somehow now producing broken government? Madison himself noted the conundrum that is there in the constitutional scheme. He said in 51, Not enough controls on power allows for abuse and arbitrariness. Too many checks and balances unduly restricts government's capacity to act. So how then did he imagine that the problems of American Republican democracy would be resolved? Should Americans continue? Should we continue with this finely wrought scheme? Or should, as I suggested earlier, might Madison say, if he were here tonight, would he say, all right, why don't you guys rethink it? See what you come up with. No. I think not. Consider the extent to which the Constitution, the constitutional outcomes of American democracy are influenced by how the nation's income and wealth are distributed. I'm describing a circumstance that we face. Are distributed among the people. Owing to the Citizens United decision, but not just to that decision, basically to a whole host of regulatory decisions and other policies, that the business corporation is now one of the people. We the people, you, me, and General Motors. It's standing on its influence on the campaigns of that ruling and of that definition of the people, and of securing the First Amendment rights to free speech on behalf of corporations, has affected every aspect of American policymaking. It's affected our ability to deliberate. It's affected our ability to decide. It's affected what the government ultimately is able to do. Money enables some people to speak much more loudly and much more often over many more media than other people can. And legislators hear these booming voices, and they cannot help, under modern technology and the state of our affairs, cannot help but pay attention to those booming voices. For one thing, they're going to need money in order to have booming voices of their own. And so that's what we're basically living with. And the question is, could the founders have kind of imagined that? What we can imagine, I think, is that they would have recognized that as a political question. But they might well have scorned or pointed out to us, warned us, that the founders had no particular love for political parties, much less for a two-party system. And they very well might, one of the things they feared was that political parties would be able to organize politics in such a way that would be inimical to the public welfare. So what they might say, and what we might hear them murmuring now, is why don't we just have two parties? Why don't we have more than that? Other countries have more than that. They may have parliamentary systems, but there's no reason why we think all of our values and interests could be summarized in just Republican doctrine and Democratic doctrine. There's many other ways of thinking through how we ought to organize politically and how we ought to, therefore, let voters choose. The founders were wise enough to understand the vulnerability of their handiwork to the power of base motives, which in this case, according to this example, self-seeking wealth and private power. They arrived at those checks and balances, as I've already been saying, as a result of compromise. And in assessing the system's vulnerabilities, what they finally did, or what is implied in what they did and what Madison says he did, is appeal to the virtue of the people. And Madison's argument in Federalist 51 is compelling, and I think this is one of the best parts of the Federalist Papers, and one of the least, I think, I may be wrong about this because I'm not a constitutional lawyer or scholar, but particularly, but it seems to me that that it's a little quoted passage. And let me read it. I'm reading it, man. Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society, end meaning goal. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty be lost in the pursuit. In a society under the forms of which the stronger faction can readily unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may be said to reign, as in a state of nature. Where the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger. And as in the latter state, even the stronger individuals are prompted by the uncertainty of their condition to submit to a government which may protect the weak as well as themselves. So, in the former state, will more powerful factions or parties be gradually induced by a like motive to wish for a government which will protect all parties, the weaker as well as the more powerful? That is a powerful passage, and it has to do with the responsibilities of the strong as well as the interests and needs of the weak. Even within the scheme in the Constitution, he is saying liberty might be lost and anarchy reign unless the stronger parties submit to a government that protects all parties, the weaker as well as themselves. So it's a value that he is articulating that is basically essential, that separates democratic government from far worse alternatives. Now you might say, well, appeal to Adam Smith again. Adam Smith, who was the author of the Doctrine of Free Markets, that are certainly interpreted as unregulated markets by conservatives, and regarded as sort of the opposite of constraint on self-interest and greed. But that's not true. Smith, and this is again very seldom quoted passages from Adam Smith. Smith suggested not only the prospect of economic transformation and a dramatic enhancement of national wealth, but as well the necessity of regulating the agents of such transformation for the conservation of civil rights and for the just distribution of its benefits. Smith cautioned that, quote, civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor. This is Adam Smith talking. Or of those who have some property against those who have none at all. Smith acknowledges that regulation may no doubt be regarded by some as a violation of individuals' natural rights, natural liberty. But these exertions of the natural liberty of a few individuals, which might endanger the security of the whole society, are and ought to be restrained by the laws of all governments. So again, another value. It's a different way of expressing what Madison was expressing in talking about the responsibilities of the stronger to the weaker as well as themselves. And Smith takes it directly to to public policy. Regulation, in effect, a more colloquial way of putting it is markets require adult supervision. And that's basically what Adam Smith is saying, that that has to be recognized by all governments. So it is ironic that the legitimacy of American political institutions, sustained as they are by a written constitution and the rule of law, basically depend upon some unwritten and essentially unenforceable faith that the people as sentinels of justice, not only on law or legality, but that law itself should be, that the rule of law itself should be regarded as an object of the faith of the people, that in that as a means of justice. The Riddle of America, I'm using another phrase that historian Eric Foner once called it, a Riddle of America that, of course, is the fuel for the American studies enterprise in Europe. Why does that country behave the way it does? Why are they insane? Why can't they give people health care? I spend time in Spain every summer. Explain again why people don't have health insurance. It's harder when you don't know how to speak Spanish, of course. Anyway, it's explained this way. The authority and of equal importance, the legitimacy of America's governing institutions and their outcomes is the faith placed in them by citizens, elected officials and judges, faith requiring a sense of responsibility on the part of all to the principles that protect all. As America's recent political crises demonstrate, that lack of faith among powerful factions, increasingly powerful factions, can easily be understood as jeopardizing not only liberty and justice, but it threatens the well-being, as we now know, of in a globalized world, of peoples far distant. Sustaining that sense of responsibility of all to all is the continuing political duty of the people themselves. If he were here this evening, Benjamin Franklin might say, as he did on the final day of the Constitutional Convention, that every member of the Constitutional Convention, but why don't we call them members of legislative bodies, should, quote, doubt a little of his own infallibility. And Madison would surely remind us that if structures fail, we voters, the candidates, the office holders, must be, can be no less than partisans of virtue, lest those that we lose altogether the liberty and justice for all that is the full purpose of our democracy. I'm done.
Fortunately, we have access to Larry for the rest of the evening. We could probably take 2 or 3 questions at this point. 1, 2, yes, David.
Yeah, in listening to your constitutional history and your rendition of the founders.
Could you, speak up as well as you can if you don't mind, because as my daughter says, you can't see, you can't hear, you can't stand up.
Yeah, in listening to your rendition of constitutional history, the founders and the virtues of compromise, I think back to the 3/5 compromise. Yeah. I remind everybody that Texas did secede, that there was a civil war, and that In that context, if the founders were to come back, I think they might look at that as broken government more than what we have today, and they might see that as more relevant to their own handiwork than what we have today. So I just wonder your comments about that, because it seems to me the Civil War it is a major event in American constitutional history, and it did change things, and it does reflect on the founders.
No, and I alluded to that. I meant to allude to that, that when I indicated that it's been worse than it is now. Ultimately, however, the Union was preserved. Can you imagine, David, or any of us, can we imagine where the Union does break up? Can we even contemplate that, where it happens and there's no war fought to stop it? I think we are seeing things now that we haven't seen for a long time in the same form, or maybe ever, as some would say. Can we survive that with the current sense of trust, or lack of it, the current attitudes towards political participation, and the current interest in a better politics? And I think those are real questions. But you're right about the Civil War, but it was fought and won on behalf of the Union. And I wonder if that'll always be the case. That may be too dire of a warning.
Lee, go ahead.
I'm wondering why there isn't more discussion these days about structural changes. Just thinking back to political science, not too many years ago, we used to have big debates about the virtues of a parliamentary system versus this separated system that we have. Has this diminished because it's just too complicated, too impossible, or is it still a lively discussion?
I don't think it's a lively discussion anymore, but I may be wrong about that, but I don't sense that. I think that there may be a couple of reasons why. One is that it's a tough sell. The other is that, imagine reopening the Constitution, or imagine holding a constitutional convention now. I don't think anybody wants that. I think that could be a real revelation as to how divided we can be. And in the absence of a public education effort that should, that some wealthy individuals actually, ironically, do try to conduct, Pete Peterson and others. I don't think scholars see that as a relevant way to go at this particular time. There's lots of things we could discuss, and we've discussed them in the past. We had a discussion in, I don't know when it was, 60s and 70s about complaints that why don't we have a parliamentary system, and why don't we actively consider it? Questions about proportional voting versus first past the post elections. I think the question of political parties and political organizations. There's a lot of things there's a lot of structural things that we could be discussing. The authority, the reorganization authorities of the president, a line item veto, a whole bunch of things that have been discussed at times aren't particularly being discussed now. The think tanks aren't particularly there. I don't know any academics that are terribly active doing that kind of thing. And right now, the kind of dysfunction seems to be inhibiting some as Gerson was saying, it inhibits rational discussion of those kinds of serious issues and the ways that we might address them. Fiscal measures. How do you balanced budget amendment that some conservatives are, I think, kind of one of the worst ideas you can imagine. So there's this sort of, let's not go there.
One more question, yes.
How important a threat do you think voter suppression?
Pardon me?
The current voter suppression initiatives. How much of a threat do you think that's going to be? Like in Florida and Pennsylvania, the voter suppression that the League of Women Voters have stopped trying to register voters.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I think that Florida really has inhibited voter registration, has it not?
Yes.
I think the Justice Department denied Texas law that would require, it's the Florida thing, because there's some everybody watches Texas to make sure that we don't declare independence or, invade Oklahoma. But the irrelevance of their voter suppression laws, they're argued, of course, to be what's wrong with asking for a photo ID. Well, there's all kinds of things wrong with that. I think that's one of the signs of dysfunction, is that there's so much support for these so-called voter suppression laws. I think there's, in many ways, lots of ways, all ways maybe, they're shameful. But because of the motives behind them and because of the ways that they're enforced. So if your question is, do I think that's
A big threat.
Yeah. Big threat, yeah, I think it's a threat. I think it's a threat anytime we seek to reduce or do we deliberately take steps, several states take steps that reduces voting rather than increases it. And I don't fear, I think the fear of illegal voters is vastly overrated, vastly overstated. My personal view, I'm not an expert on that subject, but it's my personal view.
One more question. Yes.
So speaking of voter suppression, I'm wondering what your opinion is on the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United in 2010.
And when?
The Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, and what kinds of repercussions it could have on the functionability of our government.
Well, I was talking about that tonight. The Citizens United case, I don't know. David, is he still there? Tell me what is a plausible argument for why free speech protections should extend to corporations or even to money.
Well, money was decided in Buckley versus
Yeah,
earlier.
right.
And corporations in American law are often conceived of as persons. When you conceive of a corporation as a person, so it can sue and be sued, you can extend that to saying they have, as a person, a corporation would have free speech, which in this context would mean the ability to spend as much money as they want.
So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about how the award works, and then I'll recognize the individual who will receive it. To make sure it's fair, we send the papers that the students submit for the competition to a committee of 3 external scholars. So we're not picking our favorites by any stretch. This year, those were Jeff Winger from the University of Georgia, Elisa Hicklin-Fryer from the University of Oklahoma, and our own PhD alum, Amanda Girth, who is now an assistant professor in the John Glenn School of Public Affairs at Ohio State. And so the 3 reviewed all of the papers, and were very enthusiastic about the quality across the board. But they felt that one of them was particularly well-developed, that it was particularly adept at using theory to guide questions, theory to guide the research method, and then to use a rigorous methodology to test the questions being asked, such that there was a real loop from theory to method and then back again to theory. And that's what we want our students to learn how to do very effectively, so it's very good for me to hear that we have students doing that and accomplishing it. So I would like to recognize the award-winning paper now. And this gives me great pleasure because this is an individual who's going to be very embarrassed when he comes up here to receive his award. The paper is titled The Effect of School District Tax and Expenditure Limitations on States' Education Funding After the No Child Left Behind Act. And that was a paper written by our second-year PhD student, Michael Hayes. Michael, come on up.
Well, we've kind of come to the end of our agenda tonight, but there are a lot of people that I want to thank. In particular, I want to thank Stephanie Newbold, who's put in a day coordinating this award, and I want to recognize her because she's just been chosen as a Supreme Court fellow for next year, and we're all very proud of her. And a round of applause for Stephanie would be great. And then there are a ton of people that I want to thank, but the food is getting warm, so let me just thank a few. First of all, I want to thank David Barata, who for 3 years has been putting these together. And David is in the back of the room. David's been working hard on all of these efforts. Glynis Hokinson from the Development Office has been instrumental in helping to coordinate materials. Aaron Crawford, who is here. Aaron joined us last year to do a variety of things like this and more, but she didn't expect to be carrying tripods probably across campus to be able to do those. Jocelyn Johnston, who couldn't be here tonight, she's engaged in a presentation with some of the leading scholars on contracting, and so she wasn't able to make it. She sends her regards. Jocelyn and Bill Leogrand, who left in terms of funding the evening's events. Most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming, and especially the Levine family for allowing us to share one of the leading scholars in the field with all of our students. And so thank you very much. Food, I think, is about ready in the back, so we encourage you to stay for our reception, and we look forward to seeing you next year.